democratic theory, political discourse analysis, and so on. And he's also the principal investigator of the ERC project named Prefiguring Democracy Futures, Cultural and Theoretical Responses to the Crisis of Political Imagination, and where you address, if I understand correctly, the crisis of democracy and representation on a global scale, and you give to it a response in terms of reinvigorating our political imagination, right? I thank you again very much for accepting our invitation, and I also wanted to thank the Master in Political Theory and Democratic Culture and the Department of Philosophy and Society for making it possible, for making this seminar possible. And you are going to deliver a talk today entitled Always Ontologize, Antagonism and the Primacy of Politics. And whatever you want, Oliver, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again.
Well, thanks a lot for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here. I had 5 or 6 years ago, I had the opportunity to, at this very floor, I think, just on the other side, to be present at a fantastic conference with a number of also Spanish speakers, which was amazing. And all the more I'm delighted to be here today at this, and I'm delighted that you are here actually at this time of the day. At what I learned from Christina in Spain is the time for the second breakfast. So instead of having second breakfast, whatever that is, I don't know, you're here to listen to, which will be definitely a very, very abstract talk, I must confess. It is a preparatory talk for also a more concrete presentation on populism I will give tomorrow afternoon. So this is, as it were, the ontological basis for that talk on populism, which will be more political. This is more philosophical. And it is about the question of political ontology, or what an ontology of the political, or even an ontology of politics could be. And it is based on what we have witnessed in recent years in political thought, namely a sometimes called ontological turn, a turn towards ontology, that is, a turn towards the science of being in general. From a political perspective, of course, so the science of being, from a political perspective, must be something political. So it's not ontology in a medieval sense of ontology, it's a post-metaphysical form of political ontology. And therefore, it is also a turn, what we could witness over the last decades, a turn towards the political as differentiated from politics in the narrow sense. So that's the emergency microphone comes in for the moment when my voice stops working.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah. Is it okay so far? So I continue. Okay. So the actual key to any political ontology, or to most of the political ontologies developed in the last couple of years, lies in the very differentiation between ordinary politics, let's say the ontic form of politics, on the one hand, and an ontological notion of the political. And this is ontological because it belongs to, or it addresses the entire field of the social, of all social facts, therefore of social being in general, rather than a particular field or practice like politics, or the system of politics as a functional system, however you want to define it. And this differentiation, as most of you know, in French between la politique and le politique, is a household conception that can be traced back to Paul Ricoeur's article in 1956, The Political Paradox, but was also taken up by many other people, Jean-François Lyotard, Claude Lefort, Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, Etienne Balibar, Jean-Luc Nancy, Philippe Lecoulavac, Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Roux, and many others. And from that historical moment on, what in post-foundational political thought, which is my previous book on this intellectual paradigm of those who use that differentiation between politics and the political in what I would think of as a form of left Heideggerianism. So from that historical moment on what I have called the political difference, this political difference came to be canonized as a basic conceptual differentiation in political thought. And it has to do with political ontology, because the political has an ontological function. It speaks to the entire, just to repeat, to the entire realm of social facts, to social being in general, and politics to a particular social practice. So it's ontic, and the political is ontological. However, as I have also tried to demonstrate in that book, the political difference does not imply a hierarchy where the political on the ontological side would be an elevated term and political practice on the ontic side would be devalued. But some critics have approached that conception of the political difference and of political ontology with criticism. Susan Buck-Morss, for instance, suspected that the move from everyday politics to political ontology is, and I quote her, a one-way street, never leading back to political practice. So her claim is that we become ontologists. We have nothing to do with politics anymore. That would be her criticism. Others have criticized what they call social weightlessness, that is an insensitivity towards social suffering. Lois McNay has made that point. Or, as Bruno Bostiels called it, the negative aura conferred upon political processes labeled by political ontologists as merely positivist, sociologist, empiricist, or ontic. So a devaluation of the ontic is what is criticized by these authors. So very often ontologists, I would claim to be an ontologist, so I feel addressed to a certain degree by that criticism. So very often ontologists are confronted with allegations of excessive abstraction at the cost of sociological concretion and political engagement. I do not believe, however, that this is the case. On the contrary, the aim of current political ontology in the majority of cases is to rejuvenate political practice in order to open up spaces for precisely challenging patterns of subordination. In this spirit, its attack is not directed against ordinary politics as such, but against a post-conflictual politics that seeks to divest politics of anything political. So post-politics, if you wish. What is more, by redirecting attention to the ultimately conflictual nature of all things social, and this is what an ontology of the political does. Such an ontology compels us to develop a comprehensive political perspective on the social world. Not in the sense of assuming that everything is political in terms of systemic politics, the political system, but in the sense that all social affairs are political in terms of being grounded by the political, that is to say, of being grounded through instances of conflict, power, subordination, oppression, exclusion, and decision, as much as, of course, resistance, opposition, confrontation, association, or consensus building. These are all political modalities that structure our social world. And political ontology tends to highlight the politicality of our world, which is a move similar to what feminists did in the 1970s when they diagnosed the same politicality with regard to the personal and the private. That what appears non-political on the surface may in fact have deeply political roots. The private might be very much political. And political ontology does very much the same thing. It directs our view at the political roots of things which, at the surface, do not seem to be political. Sensitized by such an ontology, social analysis will be prompted to search for modes of the political in the most unexpected places. So if you take on your ontological glasses, so I have my ontological glasses, if you take them on, you see conflict, power, subordination everywhere. So Foucault took on his ontological classes. He would not, of course, agree with that description. He would not think of himself as an ontologist, but nevertheless he was. And he took it on, and what he saw was power everywhere, right? So famous thing. So it makes sense to, put on your ontological glasses. Therefore, I claim against Frederick Jameson's famous injunction, always historicize. That was his imperative. It makes sense that in order to have a really political perspective on the world, we should always ontologize. But what do I mean when speaking about the ontological character of the political? Be it granted that to speak about the political as such does not say very much yet. We have to specify the political, or name it. As Alain Badiou once remarked, to think is to give a name to being. While for Badiou, being is of a mathematical nature. Antonio Negri would call being by the name of the multitude. There are many more proposals for naming being. But from the perspective of a slightly different Marxist tradition, I would hold that the appropriate name for the political, as that which describes the ontological nature of all social facts, is antagonism, a term with a long intellectual tradition. It has to do with conflict, but not only conflict in the ontic sense of people fighting each other, but in a broader ontological sense that is more fundamental than a friend-enemy relation. For what we see at work in Marx, from a philosophic perspective, is nothing other than Hegel's famous labor of the negative. One of the latest inheritors to this tradition is Ernesto Laclau, whose most decisive theoretical contribution, in my view, is precisely his conception of antagonism. And in my book, Thinking Antagonism, and this is a presentation based on this book, I have tried to tease out the full ontological implications of that approach, while in the other book mentioned by Christina, entitled Conflictual Aesthetics, I have developed the implications of such an ontology for practices of artistic activism. So as Laclau claimed, every society, every political order, every social identity, in short, everything social, can only be instituted with respect to a negative outside, to something which brings together dispersed elements into some sort of precarious whole, some precarious totality, simply by way of negating them. Thus, antagonism institutes order, but also prevents order from totalizing itself. Society is instituted politically, and being instituted politically means being instituted through the labor of the negative, that is, through antagonism. The fact that the social world, as a rule, appears rather peaceful and not antagonistic at all has to do with the fact that it consists of sedimented routines which we can take for granted, institutions, organizations, processes. But these routines are all founded upon a moment of political grounding, of political institutions. They are grounded in antagonism because alternatives were suppressed. Relations of subordination were established. And this instituting moment of the political remains present somehow, if only in a latent mode or a sleeping mode. But it can always be reactivated as soon as new antagonisms emerge and the sedimented routines of our lives and our institutions are suddenly questioned. So we see this all the time when a general strike breaks out, as yesterday in France. So there is no way of having a routine. My flight to Spain was rerouted. We went over the Mediterranean because we could not cross France because they were on strike. We could not have landed probably, so it was safer to make it. So the routines, get distracted. This is in the moment of antagonism. Now, keeping this conception of the political, whose name is antagonism, in mind, I would now like to turn to politics. As follows from what was said so far, there is nothing intrinsically bad about politics in its ordinary modes. This is what the critics, claim, that ontologists think of politics as something, not interesting. Only the political is interesting. There is nothing bad about politics. On the contrary, without politics, it would make no sense to speak about the political, which is precisely the point of the political difference, because both sides belong to each other, and nonetheless, it's not the same. So there is a necessary relation between both sides of the political difference. In what follows, I would therefore like to present the thesis that the ontological turn in political thought does not simply consist in attributing primacy to an ontological notion of the political. This is how it is usually framed. It's the primacy of the political over ordinary politics. I think that's only half of the picture. And we could talk about maybe later in the discussion where this comes from, because it has something to do with an internal criticism in the history of Marxism in the 20th century. The primacy of the economy from a deterministic, traditional Marxist perspective. The economy was granted primacy over the superstructure. That the primacy of economy was criticized and supplanted by political theorists, also Marxists, who claimed that the political has primacy. That's an internal debate in Marxism. And so, at a historical point in the 1970s and 1980s and 90s, it was very important to talk about the primacy of the political. But I would claim that if we think about the political difference, then we need to contribute equal primacy, as paradoxical as this may sound, equal primacy to the ontic practice of doing politics, to politics. The ontic side of the political difference, political acting in the most ordinary sense, would then in turn acquire a certain ontological dignity as well. What do I mean by that? To put it in the most succinct way possible, being is acting. And to assert that being is acting is to reverse the order of priority between the ontic and the ontological, between politics and the political. We may not only insist, as it is usually done in the post-foundational paradigm of political thought, on the primacy of the political, because the picture changes if the political difference is envisaged as difference. And if we take into account that the play between the ontic and the ontological cannot be stopped, and the two instances may very well change places. So we need also to revert our perspective. What if we were to think politics not as a derivative function of the political, but rather as a practical a priori of the political? What, to be more precise, if the political did not exist as such, except when brought to life by politics? The order of priority between politics and the political would be reversed. Primacy would have to be granted to politics rather than the political. Perceived from this angle, it is not the ontological instance of antagonism that takes on the function of an ultimate ground of all social things. It is the ontic practice of politics in its grounding capacity. The claim actually is not so far removed from our Heideggerian starting point. Heidegger is Rainer Schürmann, one of the most amazing Heideggerians of the 20th century. Heidegger, as Rainer Schürmann observed, transformed the metaphysical quest for grounds by understanding any ground as grounding, as a verb, not a noun. Rather than imagining ground in terms of a solid base, we have to think of it as an activity. It was Schürmann's enormous achievement in his landmark study on being and acting to point out Heidegger's inversion of the age-old hierarchy between being and acting, where being was dominating acting. And Heidegger turns it around, and now being becomes a form of acting, an activity rather than a verb, rather than a noun. Such an inversion, of course, only makes sense in a post-foundational framework where any ground, has become questionable. When Schürmann, who belongs to, with Miguel Abençour, maybe Jacques Rancière and many others, belongs to the anarchic current in contemporary post-foundational thought, when Schürmann advocated a paradoxical anarchy principle, he did not refer to an anarchistic program of action. He referred to the quasi-transcendental structure of being. Anarchy designates the withering away, to quote Schürmann, of the rule always to seek a first from which the world becomes intelligible and masterable, of establishing principles for thinking and doing. Schürmann's important point was that the withering away of first principles will in turn assume the paradoxical function of a principle, the principle of withering away of principles. This paradox of an anarchy principle, as Schürmann continues, is dazzling because at this boundary line, which marks the end of metaphysical foundationalism, the perennial question of politics re-emerges. To quote Schürmann, what happens to the question, what is to be done at the end of metaphysics? So you see, we come full circle, we go through an ontology of being to thinking being as a form of activity, which leads us precisely to a political question, which is the political question, what is to be done? Schürmann's answer is clear. As the age of metaphysics draws to a close, action is set free from ultimate principles, and thus proves to be anarchic on principle. Yet there is a corresponding implication that remains to be carved out. If all principles are, as it was claimed, action-based, it follows that action in turn becomes the new principle of the withering away of principles. On the grounds of the absence of ultimate grounds, acting becomes the grounding instance of social being. And we can now begin to see why being may in itself be of active nature. Once having lost its status as a solid foundation, all being is grounded on acting, on the primordial activity of grounding, which in turn cannot be grounded. Translated into a theory of political difference, the ontological ground, or abyss, of social being has to actualize itself in the practical form of politics. And at this point, we must part company with Schürmann and Heidegger, who in actual fact shy away from a truly political notion of acting. What they defend is a form of acting without activism. Indeed, what they defend is nothing other than a higher form of passivism, of an utterly passive activity. You may remember Heidegger, the later Heidegger, in the pastoral scenery sketched by the later Heidegger. Man, the guardian of being, as he calls man, is supposed to remain passively active. That is to say, man acts by retaining a passive attitude towards the unfolding play of being. It hardly needs to be pointed out that such a notion of passive activity comes at a heavy price, the depoliticization of acting. The political nature of being is repudiated in the very moment in which it is affirmed. Schürmann's search for an other politics is a search for a politics without politics, a way of acting, in his words, other than being effective or strategic. Any kind of strategic and effective action would be dismissed by Heidegger as well as Schürmann as metaphysical. And if for Schürmann actions are supposed to turn into, as he says, a groundless play without why, this might be a good portrayal of maybe the ontological nature of the political, but it does not capture the ontic nature of politics. Is there any kind of politics that would ever amount to a play without why? A politics that does not involve strategic reasoning or seek to achieve particular goals would be hardly imaginable as politics. Because of their elevated ontological pre-assumptions, Heidegger and Schürmann are ill-equipped to develop a truly political notion of politics. Notwithstanding his Nazi episode, there is an anti-political bias of Heidegger's thinking that may derive from his philosophical rather than political pre-assumptions. With Heidegger's insistence on an ontology of difference at the expense of an ontology of negativity, the world of politics is removed from view. So my claim is that we need to think about negativity, not only difference. Negativity is the most important dimension of the political in the Essex school tradition that was initiated by Ernesto Laclau and Jean Damouf, and given its theory of hegemony, is arguably the school of thought closest to real-life politics among all the other political ontologies and political theories, from Nancy to Badiou, whoever. Antagonism in this trajectory is the name of the political, as I said. And the political assumes its grounding function by erecting a line of demarcation vis-à-vis the entirely negative or negatory outside of any given political order. It is true, Heidegger also knows about the terror before nothing and nihilation, and he criticized Hegel for retaining a notion of negativity that was not sufficiently radical, but he did not provide us with a better alternative. Instead, he reverted to a Zen-like pacifism. To develop a more realistic picture of political acting, the Hegelian tradition has to be taken on board. And I would submit that today's post-foundational notion of antagonism has its historical roots in Hegel's famous labor of the negative. A post-foundational ontology of difference, therefore, has to be supplemented by an ontology of radical negativity. The latter must inform our notion of ontic politics, a form of acting that exhausts itself in the Derridian play of difference, in an endless postponement of its political goals, could hardly be called political. Politics begins with negation. From an ontological perspective, that would of course imply the emergence of an antagonism as an event, yet from the perspective of ontic practices, negation has to be brought about. Negativity, in other words, is not simply out there as a cosmic principle or an objective feature of the world. Negativity is to be produced by our actions. Therefore, when trying to invert the order of priority between the ontological and the ontic, one has to insist on negativity as an ontic practice, because antagonism will only emerge when activated by our worldly actions. There is antagonism because politics proceeds through negation. In order to fully account for this reversible or circular relation between politics and the political, Heidegger should be supplemented with the left Hegelian tradition. In fact, the intuition that being is acting is inherent to the whole tradition of radical negativity that runs from Hegel via Marx to Laclau. Nobody had a clearer idea of the activist nature of being than Alexandre Koshev, who inaugurated an entire series of 20th century ontologies of negativity. So he was, instrumental in getting Sartre to his theory of negativity and many others. In his celebrated lectures on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, Koshev, inspired by Heidegger and Marx long before Schürmann, insisted on a conception of being as acting, but being as acting through negation. To give you the quote, the central quote by Koshev. So, man is not a being that is. He is a nothingness that annihilates through the negation of being. Now, the negation of being is action. That is why Hegel says, the true being of man is his action. Not to act, therefore, is not to be as a truly human being. It is to be as sign, as given, natural being. Hence it is to fall into decay. to become brutish. And this metaphysical truth is revealed to man through the phenomenon of boredom. The man who, like a thing, like an animal, like an angel, remains identical to himself, does not negate himself, i.e. does not act, is bored, and only man can be bored. End of the quote. This is one of the key passages in Koshev's lecture series, and in my view, it's also one of the key passages of 20th century philosophy. So there's unfortunately no space to develop an in-depth interpretation, but let me indicate just one of the most important aspects. Koshev has been charged with anthropologizing Hegel and Heidegger, yet what is called man in this passage is devoid of any positive human essence. The human being is non-identical with herself. If any kind of being is to emerge from this non-identity, it can only be grounded on human actions. And all action, in turn, is devoid of a positive essence too, as to act simply means to negate being. As Koshev continues explaining, quote, in fact, man can be satisfied only by action. Now, to act is to transform what is real. And to transform what is real is to negate the given. End of quote. The end of action, if achievable, would mean the end of negation, which would lead to the end of politics, and for Koshev, to the end of history. And from there, right into a post-political world of boredom and self-identical animality. In two steps, Koshev presents us with an activist anthropology, or rather, an ontology of active being. First, antagonism, especially the Hegelian antagonism between lord and bondsman, is brought down to the worldly ground of action. And second, action, the negative essence of human being, is defined by Koshev as the negation of the given. The negation of the given. Now, who or what would be the subject of political acting? Evidently, for a post-foundational conception of agency, action is not reducible to class struggle, but remains anarchic. In order to determine the function of the political subject, the task will be to reconnect an ontic view on action with the general ontology of antagonism, which is not a trivial task, because it's a circular, as I said, a reversible logic between the ontic and the ontological, politics and the political. We cannot avoid moving back and forth between these two registers, adhering to, if we want to escape Heideggerian passivism on the one hand, and activism for activism's sake on the other hand. So the first would mean that we end up in political paralysis, and the second, if we entirely focus on agency, would mean that we fall into the trap of political voluntarism. The dilemma is obvious. Acting proceeds by activating antagonism. However, antagonism, as an outside instance of radical negation, cannot be activated by sheer will, by our sheer will. Instead of bypassing the dilemma, I propose to hold onto these two apparently contradictory claims. A, in order to act politically, antagonism must be activated. Politics, in other words, is the ontic business of activating the political. And B, from an ontological perspective, antagonism cannot be activated, because antagonism belongs to the order of the event. It either breaks out or not. And you all have this experience, which might sound very abstract, but it isn't. Have this experience of the fact that antagonism cannot be activated by sheer will. Whenever you try to organize a demonstration and nobody shows up, right? So that's the experience of the impossibility of activating antagonism by sheer will. I cannot will antagonism into the world. It's either there or not. It's in a certain sense objectively out there as an ontological event. So you see the dilemma. On the one hand, we need to activate antagonism. On the other hand, we cannot activate it. Antagonism may emerge at any point in the social fabric, yet it cannot be forced into the open. Moreover, no self-identical source of action exists from where as a ground from where antagonism could be forced to emerge. There is no willing subject that could serve as the foundation for our action. That would be a metaphysical idea of subjectivity. But how to activate what cannot be activated? And who is the subject supposed to activate? What escapes activation? Facing this conundrum, the only answer, congruent with the post-foundational framework of political difference, is the following. Political agents act as if they could activate antagonism. Which is a famous formula, the as if, which goes back to Kant, but then reappears in Rancière and many other places. Sartre, for instance. And here I turn it into that formula. Political agents act as if they could activate antagonism. They actually cannot, because you all have this experience that you cannot activate antagonism. So you need to act as if you could activate antagonism. The volitional subject of politics as an impossible yet necessary metaphysical fiction. Political actors cannot but think of themselves as the subject of their actions. For otherwise they would not start acting in the first place. While we are not the source of our actions, we must attribute to ourselves the capacity to act, unless we want to remain passive bystanders. What is more, political agency results from an encounter with antagonism, while at the same time an agent is supposed to act antagonistically, that is to negate the given. So rather than being the source of their actions, political agents emerge from this circular process in a manner not entirely different from Cauchyvian dialectics. A given social identity, a social group for instance, is activated into becoming a political agent by a purely negative instance of experience negativity. And by starting to negate the given in turn, comes to emerge as a political actor. An actor who may very well pronounce, I am because I negate. And I negate because my being is negated. This is the experience of my being negated. For instance, in Israel, the experience of many people in civil society feel their being negated by governmental actions. So we have a general strike today. Yesterday we had a general strike in France. Today we have a general strike, not a general strike, but today we have a strike of many people in the transport business in Germany. Why do they strike? Because they feel that their being is negated. And what they do? They negate the given in turn. Politics, therefore, is a truly circular affair. As political agents, we are activated by antagonism in the very moment we encounter conflict and contingency. And yet our task as political agents is to activate antagonism in the first place. From this follows what I would call the political imperative. Act as if you could activate what activates you. Rather than acting in the mode of Heidegger's passive activity, one has to shift to a mode of active passivity, as it were. Acting amounts to not more than putting a wager on the emergence of antagonism. Act by thinking that if I act, then antagonism may emerge. By virtue of being an attempt, and not more than that, it may easily fail. And yet, antagonism must be activated. There is no other possibility for antagonism to emerge, as it does not in any substantial sense pre-exist its activation by ontic practice. Antagonism as an instance of radical negativity, far from constituting something of the order of a natural force somewhere out there, detached from our practice, is always politically produced. What from an ontological perspective is the name for an insurmountable blockade of society, an insurmountable negativity at the ground of society, in fact is constructed from an ontic perspective through a particular political practice, the negation of the given. No doubt, there could always emerge the problem that, put trivially, the given does not bother you very much. The dominant powers may be too strong, hegemony too deeply entrenched for particular politics to succeed in reactivating sedimented antagonisms. But be that as it may, a dormant antagonism does not awake from its slumber by itself. Its awakening must be provoked, without any guarantee for success. Politics, by way of protest, is about provoking antagonism. With regard to the latter, the political agent acts as agent provocateur. This agent is Koshev's man, the nothingness that annihilates through the negation of being. Now you may ask, and here I come to an end, you may ask, so where's the positive side of all this? There must be something positive to that negation. And you're right. As we have seen, to act politically, that is to negate the given, requires the capacity to act. A capacity an agent does not possess a priori. The passage from passivity to activism is premised upon an experience of frustration, of negation. But more is needed for the given to be negated. The capacity to act has to be asserted by the agent. So the agent needs to assert her own capacity to act. An agent has, as we saw, to act as if it were equipped with the capacity to act. Let me expand on the metaphysical implications of such a mode of action, because it does have metaphysical implications. Political action presupposes a quasi-metaphysical will, a will to will, as a will to foundation. The agent acts as if it were a volitional subject in command of its own will. So an entirely metaphysical idea, of course, right? They're a subject in command of its own will. I mean, we know since at least Freud that such a subject does not exist, except in politics. So the agent acts as if it were a volitional subject in command of its will, and in order to do so, the agent must will its own will. For, as Heidegger puts it very succinctly and wonderfully, willing is to will yourself. The circularity is unavoidable if we are to move from a foundationalist to a post-foundational theory of acting. When ultimate grounds dissipate, political subjects must pull themselves up their bootstraps. But the point does require two specifications. First, from a political perspective, this will has to be willed. This will that has to be willed does not pertain to an individual. It can only belong to a collective agent, which is why Antonio Gramsci speaks of a collective will. Therefore, the capacity to will flows from the collective nature of the agent. It results from the force of politically being in common and of organizing with a view to attaining hegemony. If individuals or aggregate members of a hegemonic project are also equipped with a capacity to will, then because they participate in a collective faculty of volition, they are capacitated to act by the power radiating from a hegemonic project. They, as individuals, what I'm saying here is that as individuals, we can only act because we are members of a collective will. So the collective will is the source of our own capacity to act. Because an entirely solitary individual is not able to act politically. So if individuals, these individuals are capacitated to act by the power radiating from a hegemonic project. Should this power wane, their capacity to act will also be debilitated. And secondly, we should not make the mistake of imagining this will to be a destructive force. In order to negate the given, I said an agent has to affirm capacities that it does not possess. In a moment of self-assertion, one's will to act has to be affirmed, for otherwise we would remain in a state of couch potato passive nihilism. Becoming active, in other words, is premised upon the affirmation of our capacity to act, that is our will to will. To act and to negate means to affirm affirmation. The latter insight, which may appear counterintuitive, finds support in what arguably was one of Gilles Deleuze's greatest achievements, his early interpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy, where this formula of affirming affirmation comes from. Deleuze points out that in Nietzsche, becoming active is affirming and affirmative. Now this might at first sight seem to contradict my definition of acting as the negation of the given, and Deleuze himself rejects any compromise between Nietzsche and Hegel. However, pure affirmation as presented in Nietzsche does involve negation. Only in simple affirmation, in the year of the ass, of the pack animal that bears the burden of the given, only in that form of simple affirmation is the given accepted as it is. Nietzsche attacks this idea of simple affirmation. Simple affirmation means that I accept the given. And now, grandiosely, I think, Deleuze speaks about the very point of Nietzsche. Quote, Nietzsche's argument can be summarized as follows. The yes, which does not know how to say no, the yes of the ass, is a caricature of affirmation. This is precisely because it says yes to everything which is no, because it puts up with nihilism. It continues to serve the power of denying, which is like a demon whose every burden it carries. The Dionysian yes, on the contrary, knows how to say no. It is pure affirmation. It has conquered nihilism and divested negation of all autonomous power. But it has done this because it has placed the negative at the service of the powers of affirming. To affirm is to create, not to bear, put up with, or accept. So, end of quote. To affirm the given with the simple yes of the yes of the ass is to affirm the nihilistic condition of the world. It is to make peace with those relations of exclusion, oppression, and subordination that to a large extent define the given. The ass is a burden-carrying creature devoid of political agency. A single yes is therefore not sufficient. As Deleuze says, two affirmations are necessary to turn the whole of negation into a mode of affirming. Acting means to affirm affirmation, we can conclude from this. Political agency therefore, must not be confused with either passivism, what Nietzsche called passive nihilism, or destruction for destruction's sake, as in cases of adventurism or blind insurrectionism. True political activity begins when, in Deleuze's words, the will to nothingness is converted and crosses over to the side of affirmation, when it begins to relate to a power of affirming, when it becomes a will to will. Affirmation is needed because, as it was argued, an agent must assert itself as the subject of its actions. That is to say, it has to metaphysically affirm its capacity to negate as a capacity to will. But what is more, affirmation is necessary because to negate the given only makes sense when put in the service of the creation of a positive project. A project that has the potential for recruiting widespread consent and for becoming major, to universalize itself hegemonically. In this latter sense, to affirm is to create, would mean that we must bring to life, as Gramsci would put it with reference to Machiavelli, a modern prince. By affirming our own will to act, we also affirm this project of collective will formation. There are good reasons for turning toward a theory of double affirmation. In recent years, especially in the anarchic current of post-foundational political thought, adventurist and insurrectionist theories have gained attraction. Think of the manifesto coming insurrection by the Invisible Committee a couple of years ago. The insurrectionary paradigm is premised upon a rather one-dimensional notion of attacking the state or the police order, as if the state existed as homogeneous bloc that could be frontally attacked by Mayoric grouplets. Miguel Abençour's more sophisticated notion of a wild democracy pitted against the state bears traces of the same misconception. And even the Rancièrean famous disagreement of a part of no part appears to be modeled upon a binary logic of insurrection. As Rancière says, whoever has no part, the poor of ancient times, the third estate, the modern proletariat, cannot in fact have any part other than all or nothing. But subjecting politics to a logic of all or nothing means to relegate political action, which in reality unfolds on a complex terrain of a multiplicity of antagonisms, to the realm of the imaginary. We are given a blunt choice by these authors, either passivity or insurrection. No space is left in this framework for any positive political program that could provide us with a starting point for constructing a new hegemony. Yet the creation of a new collective will is precisely what is needed today at a historical conjuncture when neoliberal hegemony crumbles and the political vacuum grows. We are not living through a revolutionary situation, though, that would warrant a politics of all or nothing. What we experience, rather, is the increasing dislocation of the hegemonic formation in most Western countries. In a historical situation like this, the political task consists in bringing to life a new prince, that is, in affirming affirmation. Such a project, to come to an end, is not furthered by insurrectionary fantasies, nor is it furthered by the empty phraseology of a metaphysical idea of communism, as in Badiou, or the invocation of a pseudo-Leninist avant-garde party, as by Jody Dean. Approaches like these, I think, have historically exhausted themselves. For practical reasons, because a new hegemon, a new prince, can only result from what in France you would call la convergence des luttes, the convergence of actually existing struggles. But they also have exhausted themselves for theoretical reasons, as in politics, the given cannot be negated in total. In order to attack the totality of what is given, one would have to find an Archimedean point beyond this totality. Without a point that could provide us with an ultimate foundation for our actions, it is impossible to negate abstract totalities, such as the system or the state. The very idea of a monolithic system of oppression is phantasmatic, as is the attempt at attacking that system head-on. Negation, therefore, can only mean the negation of something concretely given, rather than merely imagined as something as an all-powerful totality. And the same is to be said about affirmation. It only makes sense as determinate affirmation, the creation of an actually existing project and collective will, which is a new hegemonic project. And this is precisely the point that will lead me to the talk tomorrow, which is on populism and the possibility of a radical democratic form of populism, which is precisely the question of how should a new hegemonic project that negates the given should look like. So I leave it here rather than talking for another hour.
Okay. Thank you very much.